introduce our three speakers. Henry is the city reporter at PA Media, which is the UK's biggest newswire, based in London, but they have a few offices scattered around the country. Henry writes mostly about business-related news. You've been focusing quite a lot about focused around jobs, the economic impact of COVID-19 and how different industries have been impacted by the pandemic. He also writes about retail and hospitality news. We've also got Pippa, who's the political editor of the Daily Mirror. She was previously political editor at The Guardian, and before that spent a decade covering London and Westminster politics for the Evening Standard. And we're also joined by Andre, who's the editor of Ham and High, Islington and Hackney Gazette, and Brent Kilburn Times. Andre's also spent a few years working for local newspapers in Surrey. Ham and High is everyone's local weekly newspaper in Haringey, and Catherine actually has a monthly column where she writes on lots of different local issues. She's written past columns on young people, mental health in universities, and climate change. So that's just a brief introduction to our three speakers. We'd love for you to spend about 7 to 8 minutes each just giving us a brief introduction to your newspapers, your jobs, the respective pathways into your current position, so what you studied at universities, any internships or advice for our young people who are wanting to go into journalism. We'd also love to hear from the three of you on how you report on matters of public interest and the relationship between the media and politics and policy. So over to three of you, and then we'll finish off with the Q&A session as well. Henry, would you like to kick things off?
Yeah, of course. No, I'm happy to go first. Cheers for having me, and thank you for listening. As mentioned, I work for PA, which was called Press Association, and we're the biggest newswire in the UK. I think a lot of journalists don't even know what we specifically do, so I'll sort of give a little explainer. But basically, we're essentially a subscription service for journalists, and we'll write stories on anything which seems sort of like it's getting public's attention, and then the biggest broadcasters, the biggest national newspapers and regional press will all pick up what they want of our service, and I specifically write our sort of city news, which is business sort of focused stuff. So at the minute it's been very COVID centered, the economy and the way different businesses, be that pubs and bars that have been forced to shut, or shops where staff having to wear masks and things like that. That's sort of been a lot of what I've been writing about over the past year, and I think I think hopefully what a lot of people have been reading about. Going to how I sort of got into journalism, I was always sort of interested in writing, and I think like a lot of people, knowing that when you're sort of 16 doesn't really have an end point, and I didn't have a clue where I wanted to end up, but I knew that was something I could actually do, and found quite interesting. I then went to university and I studied history. I went to I grew up in Lincolnshire, and I went to Lancaster Uni. And I studied history there. It was while I was at uni, I sort of fell into journalism, and I went into sort of student media. I think if it's something you're considering and you're likely to go down the university route, it's something to throw yourself deep into. I was sort of did it a lot. I found a lot of opportunities that came from it, be that sort of, speaking to former students who went into it, or be that just the experience of getting in the habit of putting in phone calls to people who we had local police and things like that, and I think those processes of doing that was what really turned me on. While I was doing that, I then did sort of experience in my local paper, which is Lincolnshire Echo, and I sort of spent a bit of time there, and then went and did a master's. I think the master's, a journalism master's, after sort of studying another degree at uni, is how probably I'd say most people tend to sort of the pathway for most people into journalism at the minute. It's by no means the only thing, and I'd recommend a lot of people to try other ways of getting into it. I think there's a lot of good apprenticeships and PA and others run those and things like that. So it's definitely, and graduate schemes and things as well, but it's definitely worth looking at the different options. I wouldn't have been able to do my master's and go into journalism without getting a grant as well. So I think for a lot of people, it's, you know, you have to look at opportunities, because there are a lot there, and particularly people from a sort of diverse backgrounds. That's something that, you know, some sort of newspapers and broadcasters are actually, you know, being quite positive about at the minute. I then went into local press, like Andre, and I worked in Hull at the Hull Daily Mail for a bit over a year and a half. It was sort of, you know, a busy time and a busy paper, and I learned a lot. But while I was there, I realised that, you know, I sort of got a sense of what I wanted to be doing, and it was things that were important to local community. But I was sort of, I think some of the busyness of sort of the local paper and some of the sort of experiences I had saw me sort of focus on, you know, who are the decision makers and who's in power, and what, you know, what are the issues that are sort of affecting a lot of people's lives, away from some of the sort of you know, some of the other aspects where you sort of that was sort of ticking the newspaper over at the time. I think from there I then went into trade press for a year and wrote for a retail magazine before I got moved over to PA, where I've been for 2 years. I think from my point of view, I've really enjoyed the fact I've worked in sort of business setting, in a local newspaper setting, and in a newswire, and I think it's important to accept whatever you do in terms of your career, and especially in journalism, that being able to mold as you go along and move around is key. Because I think from my point of view, I've feel like I can do what I do fairly well, and I think part of it is because I've been able to sort of accept that, you know, you can move on, learn a bit, change what you do, and then move somewhere else, and hopefully that'll benefit you. I think from in terms of, you know, what I report on, and identifying why things should be in the public interest, I think from a point of view, what I write about, a lot of it isn't things that are immediately catchy. I'm sure a lot of, you know, I can't imagine many of you for business reporter that sounds sexy, but a lot of the stuff is still important. And I think from my point of view, the part of my job I find sort of quite interesting, but most important, is trying to make things that are of value and importance sort of easy to read and digestible. So, you know, my news reports, because they're sort of picked up by everyone, have to be just as easy to read and sort of interesting for a journalist from Financial Times working out whether or not to publish it, as someone picking it up on the metro, on the tube, and the way to work. And from my point of view, I think trying to make things work in that respect is important, and I tend to, you know, we tend to gear ourselves on a very sort of consumer focused end of it. So for example, most of the sort of news I've been covering has been sort of, you know, immediately asking the questions: how does this impact on jobs? How does this impact on the amount of money coming into someone's bank account? It'd be that to a furlough, or the impact of economy. It's those sort of questions that I always find myself sort of asking, and being able to sort of hopefully get across in a way where people gain some sort of an understanding and can be quite helpful. I think a lot as well recently we've been writing about has been focused on the economy. Obviously, again, it's not always the sort of easiest topic to get around, but it's something that at the moment has been quite important. I think for a lot of people to see how the UK is coming out of COVID, and why these decisions are being made in the way they are by people in power. I think the other thing as well is business is always quite an interesting point of view when you're looking at sort of some of the sort of corrupt aspects of society, and trying to hold people accountable, be that employers. And you know, early on in the pandemic, I was writing about Sports Direct wanting to sort of force some of their staff into stores despite being told to shut, and things like that. And that's stuff where, you know, me and Rita saw what was happening, and said, you know, this doesn't seem right. They shouldn't be allowed to this. They shouldn't be trying to force the government's hand so they can do this. And then by writing about that, you then had decision makers looking and questioning what those sort of bosses and were doing, and why, you know, and sort of force their hand to bring about hopefully sort of positive change in environment. I won't keep on too much longer, but just sort of a last point in terms of, you know, how does my work impact upon public engagement and policy. I think hopefully that was quite a good example, but from my point of view, it's mainly about sort of trying to make make news relatable, and trying to make it relatable as well for sort of different types of audience. And that's one of the tricky things we have at PA is we'll have BBC will use our sort of copy on their website or in a news report, and you'll have a local paper wanting to use the same thing, and national as well. So from our point of view, it's trying to sort of assess that breadth and try and talk about things in a way where, people can also, a local newspaper can look at it and think, oh, we can add a bit of this sort of local element into it and use the story, and similarly in a national newspaper as well. I think, as I said, I won't keep sort of much longer just in terms of me, but I think the last thing I would say in terms of if you're sort of listening in because you're interested in journalism, I'd say, the main thing you can do is just read as much as you can, and just sort of keep on tabs of the news. I think that's the reason I got into it, is just by being generally nosy, and being sort of interested, and that's as simple as it has to be. Sometimes if you find that you're sort of scrolling through, be it regarding BBC, whatever it is, and on your phone, and looking through the headlines and tapping away while you're supposed to be in conversation with your girlfriend's parents or whatever it might be, then I think that for me is what made me realize, okay, I'm really interested in the news and I want to know what's happening before everyone else does. So I think hopefully that nosiness, that interest is what can get you through, and just stay interested, and if you've got any questions at the end, then please fire anything my way.
Thank you, Henry, for such a good introduction and for those tips and pieces of advice for everyone. Andre, would you like to go ahead as well?
Sure. I think the first thing I'd say is, Henry, I'm sure some of these people are engaged, because when the chimes of the BBC app came up just now with the latest Scottish updates, there were certainly some eyes that went down to phones, which is good. As was said, I'm editor of the Ham and High and 3 other newspapers around North London. So we're local newspapers and there to kind of serve and inform local communities. I didn't start off looking at journalism. I went to school, grew up in Guernsey, and went to university and studied philosophy at UCL, which I'd recommend to anybody who's able to do it. It's a brilliant thing to do, but there's no job at the end of it. So I ended up working in finance for a decade or so and absolutely hating it. And one day quit my job in the city and had nothing to do. And somebody recommended trying a journalism course. So I did a fast track at NCTJ and absolutely loved it. And I think one of the reasons I loved it was because I'm not a natural, I'm not a natural socializer necessarily. I'm not the most outgoing person in the room ever. But if you've got it as your job, it's amazing that suddenly there's a kind of reason to approach people. There's a reason to interact, to ask questions. And it really suited me and it really worked for me. So passed that and went and worked as a reporter in Surrey on local papers based out of Guildford and Woking. Got promoted a little bit, applied for a job in Devon, became an editor of some newspapers in Devon. And then that was for the company I'm with now, Archant, who then suggested that the Ham and High job was coming available. And I'd lived in London before, so took it up, came straight back. And then within a few days of getting here, there was a general election. That was the one 2 Decembers ago. And then within 3 months, the world kind of changed. So it's similar to Henry at PA. It's been a strange 2 years to get to know patches and jobs. But I think one of the things we've seen over the last 2 years is how important it is, how important the media is. And, as none of us really want to talk about the media as a kind of amorphous mass, because there's so many angles to it. There's individual different titles, there's different people. But as a thing, the media has done amazing things over the last couple of years, as well as some bad things, as well as dropping the ball sometimes. But it's really important. One of the questions I was given here was identifying matters of public interest. And of course, we're newspapers, so we don't just write about matters of public interest. We write about things that are interesting to the public as well. You know, we write showbiz stuff, we do sports stuff, which arguably is not necessarily always in the public interest to write. But essential to our role is doing things in the public interest as well. It's holding authorities to account, and it's shining light on injustices that wouldn't otherwise be seen. And it's, you know, as a simple, its existence is important for the public interest as well. The fact that we have open courts in this country is a great thing. Justice is, on the whole, it's open, it's there to be seen how it works, so people get free trial. One of the reasons that happen is because the media can go and can see what's happening, because frankly the public don't have time to. So that's one aspect of it. And then there's things like the international aid budget, which Catherine's off wrestling with now. I mean, it's an important thing, whichever side you fall on the debate. How those billions are spent and millions are spent is important. And without the media putting it on the agenda, this stuff can happen without people knowing about. And in this case, it is worrying that the poorest people in the world are losing out on money as things stand and on help as things stand. So there's that side of it. There's lots of questions about public interest in terms of how it balances with other things. So you'll all have seen the news story the other week about Matt Hancock and his personal misbehaviours. Now, what's in the public interest about somebody's love life is up for debate, and arguably, you know, there's a right to privacy. But in that case, there's a very, very clear case that this was in the course of his job. This was somebody who was employed by him. There's all kinds of questions around it. And I think it's a brilliant example of the media exposing something that's clearly in the public interest, even if there's other aspects to consider around it. There's a particular case we're covering at the moment, and probably Henry's PA are covering as well, which there was a murder in Brent, or possibly in Brent, and the woman's body was found in Devon. And I'm mentioning this only because there's an aspect of it. It's not gone to trial yet, although somebody's now been charged. There's an aspect of it where there's a certain gruesome part of the murder that's been reported in the press. And the question of public interest, not clear cut. The reporting of that particular part of the murder, there remains a question of what's taste, what's decency, what's intrusion. Lots of court cases will report, we won't give every single detail that's happened, because why are we serving those details? Why are we providing those details? There's a question of whether it's, you know, titillation, or whether it's for the sheer gruesomeness, or whether it's, you know, is just unreasonable to do so. On the other hand, we want to report what, you know, effectively what's happened in the trial, in the court case. I'm not giving any kind of judgment or clear answers here. All I'm saying is that the questions of public interest and what we look at all the time, they're always an aspect of what we're doing and what we're choosing to write about. The only other thing I was going to say for now, because I want to get onto questions really, is that the final question put to me was about how we shape public engagement. And as we touched on just at the start of this, there's the press obviously has a clear role in shaping public engagement, even in the world of social media, a very clear role. And there's two sides to the press that have always been there, and that's opinion and news and reporting. And opinion and opinion writers, column writers, is such a huge industry. The Guardian kind of led the way in a way with its comment is free sections, and people have made careers out of it, and people have, you know, debates have been led on it. But there's a very important distinction between that and reporting the news, reporting what's happened or reporting what's been uncovered. The sheer reporting of it helps drive debate. It gets it to the top of the agenda. I think there's an argument to be had, or a debate to be had, ironically, about what the role of opinion in it is in it. How much prominence should be given to a journalist's opinions, when really it's for us, the public, to make, you know, judgments about these things based on the facts, which is, from my point of view, our main role is to provide those facts. anyway, I feel like if I don't stop now, I'm going to just continue that rant for a long time. So I'll hand over to Pippa, and hopefully we'll have lots of questions.
Thank you. Hi guys, I'm Pippa Crerar. I'm political editor at the Daily Mirror, and I've been watching like Catherine, I've been watching the aid debate, and I've broken off from that because this is really important, I think, to have the chance to talk to some of you and to share our thoughts and views on journalism and offer any advice that we can. I'll zip through how I got to where I am. But like the others, I started off in sort of local and regional journalism. I'm a Scot, as you might be able to hear from my accent, and during university I did sort of bits of work experience at various newspapers back home in Edinburgh and Glasgow. It involved writing off, those days, lots of letters. These days I guess it'd be emails. I'm quite old really, to editors, all sorts of places, most of whom ignored me. Periodically somebody would get back and say, well, you know, you might be able to come in at some point, but there was always one that would reply and say, yes, well, if you can come in for a week, then we'd be happy to have you. And I just persevered. I guess that would be my first bit of advice for you, which is that if you're determined to do this, you need to persevere. And it is a competitive industry, but be prepared for people, you know, unfortunately, lots of busy editors out there, prepared for people to even not get back to you, and if they do, maybe not give you the news that you might want. But if you want to do it enough, keep asking, and somebody will give you a first opening. And then from that point, it is very much a ladder. I went after university. I did a traineeship at it's called Scott Trust. It runs The Guardian, and they had a traineeship which involved sending me to City University to do their postgraduate diploma course. These days, lots of almost all the major newspaper groups have a traineeship of one sort or another. Some do them in-house. Some will send people off to colleges which have NCTJ accredited, which is like the official journalism accreditation course for news. And others will do a mixture with other newspaper groups and regional newspaper groups and so on. And these days, not all of them are for graduates either. There's also apprenticeships. So I think just a few months ago, the News International, which obviously is responsible for the Times, Times Radio, Sunday Times, and the Sun, was advertising for apprenticeships. I think ITV does a series of apprenticeships as well. So there are media organisations that don't require a degree, so that's not necessarily a prerequisite. But after my city course, I went to work for the Scotsman back in Edinburgh and did news reporting there for a bit. But I'm afraid I had my eyes on the big smoke, wanted to come back down to London and get a job in Fleet Street, and was very keen to do political reporting. So actually ended up at PA, where I was a gallery reporter. And the difference between gallery and lobby reporter is that the gallery basically report on what goes on inside the different chambers, so sort of the legislation that goes through. It's a really great way of getting to know how Parliament works, how our legislative process works. And then sort of moved into the lobby, which is kind of the broader, you know, the bigger picture political stuff, what the parties are saying, the sort of arguments around debates like foreign aid and so on. And then basically spent the next 20 years working for a variety of different papers, the Daily Record, which is Scotland's big mass market newspaper, but down here at Westminster, and the Evening Standard. As Hina mentioned, I was there for a long time doing both national politics, but also local and borough politics, very focused on what was sort of going on at grassroots level and community level. And I think that is really important. And I've tried to sort of retain that sort of approach going forward in my political career, never forgetting actually what matters is what people who are reading whatever you're writing feel about the politics you're writing about. Spent some time at The Guardian as well as deputy political editor there, and then ended up on the Mirror a couple of years ago. And you know, the last 4 or 5 years in my career, I think, have been the most tumultuous, but also the most interesting, because we've had a series of, I've lost track of how many elections we've had, referenda, the Scottish independence one, Brexit, obviously, all the Brexit wranglings in Parliament, more elections, and then of course the pandemic. And it feels a little bit like the last 18 months I've done nothing but write about the pandemic, because it's been such a political issue, and political and science journalists in particular have been focusing on it. It's been very refreshing, if I'm completely honest, recently to have something else to write about, in terms of it almost feels like politics has been on aspic for a year, And now, finally, other issues are starting to raise their heads. So whether that is, the immigration bill or the aid cuts, or obviously the football, some of the remarks about footballers and taking the knee that we've heard from politicians in recent times, and the reaction by the football team, it's kind of been quite refreshing being able to write about some of those things too. As I mentioned, and as the others have said as well, the way I try and write about politics, particularly for a mass market paper like the Mirror, which we have our online bit of it obviously, and the paper, is almost trying to take a sort of a consumer approach to how politics affects people in the real world. While there is very much a place for all the political gossip and who's in and who's out and who's going to get reshuffled and what people are saying behind the scenes, and being a Politico, I'm fascinated by all of that. I think that that what is much more important is how any policy which the government comes up with or the opposition is challenging on actually affects your lives. And we've seen that massively in the last 18 months or so with the pandemic, whether it's that you haven't been able to go abroad for your holidays, or you've not been able to go and see your granny in Scotland, or unfortunately you've lost a loved one and not been able to visit them before they died, or you're not able to go to the pub, or indeed school. All of you will have examples of where the pandemic has affected your lives, and what we've tried to do is try and explain some of those complexities and those changes and what's going on behind the scenes in a readable way that really people can relate to. And I guess more broadly, I don't want to go on too long because I'm sure you have lots of questions. More broadly, talking about again the questions that we were asked to think about before we spoke to you about how we shape public engagement as journalists. Top of that list is trying to communicate what's going on in a way that's accessible and understandable for our readers. And our readers vary quite a lot between, our online readership profile is much younger, more liberal, more metropolitan, more affluent, probably more educated. Our newspaper readership tends to be more older, more regional, more socially conservative. And, we've got to try and span those two readerships, and on particular issues like Brexit, where they took quite different views. That was quite tricky at times. So we try and communicate what's going on. We try and analyse it, because we've got, I guess, the privilege of being up front in front of the politicians, able to ask them the questions at the press conferences, able to add a bit of insight based on our conversations we've had behind the scenes with advisors and ministers and MPs and so on. And it's our responsibility to sort of share that with our readership. And then obviously we at the Mirror have our own political slant. I'm sure lots of you will know we're left of centre, but there are obviously other papers and media organisations that take a different slant. The broadcasters, I'm sure you'll know, are required to be by statutes to be balanced. We are not bound by having the ability to sort of take a political position or back a party. And we at the Mirror back the Labour Party. That's not always been easy in recent times. The Labour Party hasn't made it very easy for us on some occasions, but that is sort of our papers, our sort of our core support, and so we continue that. And then it's also going forward journalism about how all the different ways in which we can share the news. Obviously, we have newspapers. Henry's on a wire agency, but online is obviously the future. So we all have online digital presences as well. Social media increasingly is a way that we sort of draw readers in. I tweet a lot and sort of refer back to stories that we've published on the website, and then there's broadcast as well. And I do quite a lot of I present a Radio 4 programme periodically called The Week in Westminster, and I do quite a lot of broadcasting on Sky and things as well, which I love, being able to do all these different having these different aspects to my job. And I honestly think journalism is one of the best professions in the world. It's not necessarily always the easiest, but you have the capacity to be at the front line of history when it's written. And if you really want to do it and you persevere, then then you'll get there. And it's not just political journalism or city journalism or editing. There are of course all sorts of different aspects of it, from news to features. There's showbiz. You can write reviews. You can travel and write about it. There's it's a very, very broad industry. Both in terms of the subject matter you're writing or broadcasting on, and also which part of the industry you work in. And like the others have said, I'm sure you've got lots and lots of questions, and we'd be very, very happy to answer them. But I would thoroughly recommend journalism. Don't be put off by people saying that the industry is dying, because people will always want to know how what's going on in the world and have an appetite for news. What is changing is how they consume that that news, and that's something that we as journalists always need to be on our toes over. But the appetite's still there, and yeah, and I'd encourage you to do it if it's what you want to do.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much